Strip away everything modern for a second. No heater. No coat you didn't have to fight for. No food waiting in the kitchen, no matter how bad the storm gets outside. Now drop the temperature until the air itself could kill you before sunrise. That was the reality for hundreds of thousands of years. Making it to spring wasn't guaranteed. It was a bet your ancestors somehow kept winning, over and over, in conditions that should have wiped them out. Humans have no fur. No hibernation. No fat layer built for the cold. On paper, we had no business surviving an ice age at all. So how did a body built for the heat of Africa outlast the coldest stretch this planet has ever thrown at anyone? Coming up, the invention that changed everything, the houses built from the bones of giants, and a debate that's still not settled, whether some ancient humans could actually shut their bodies down for the winter. Subscribe and let us know if you could survive a winter in the Ice Age. Let's get straight into the video. Let's be honest about what your ancestors were actually working with, because it's worse than you think. Every animal that made it through an ice age had some kind of built-in advantage. Humans had none of them. Take the fur and shelter away from a person in real ice age cold, and the countdown isn't measured in days. In brutal enough conditions, exposed skin can start to freeze in under 2 minutes, and hypothermia can set in within minutes more. Push the temperature low enough, and death can follow in under an hour. The body simply isn't built for that math. There's no thick undercoat, no dense layer of fat like a seal has, nothing that traps heat the way it needs to be trapped when the temperature drops that far. And it's not just about staying warm. It's about what the body does when things go wrong. A bear can slow its heartbeat and sleep through the worst of it, living off stored fat until the world outside becomes livable again. Humans can't do that. There's no dormant mode. No pause button. If the cold gets bad enough and lasts long enough, the body just fails. Now compare that to what was actually out there sharing the landscape. Mammoths were built for this world, with thick coats and heavy fat reserves made for exactly these temperatures. Cave bears had hibernation as a built-in escape hatch. Reindeer had the simplest solution of all. When it got too cold, they left, migrating to somewhere the conditions were survivable. Humans didn't have fur like the mammoth. Didn't have hibernation like the bear. Didn't have anywhere to walk to that would have solved the problem the way it did for the reindeer. Every advantage on that list, humans were missing. On paper, that should have been the end of the story. Wrong body, wrong climate, wrong era to be alive in. If you were betting on which species would survive an ice age based on biology alone, humans wouldn't have made the shortlist. But biology wasn't the only thing they had. What they had instead was a brain capable of solving problems no gene could solve for them, and hands capable of building the solutions that biology forgot to give them. That gap between what the body couldn't do and what the mind could figure out is where this entire story actually begins. The gap between a body that couldn't handle the cold and a mind that could work around it starts with one discovery: fire. For a long time, the earliest solid evidence of humans deliberately making fire came from a site in northern France, dated to around 50,000 years ago. That was the benchmark. Then a dig at a site called Barnham, in Suffolk, England, changed the timeline completely. Researchers there found a patch of reddened, heat-altered clay, stone hand axes cracked and warped by intense heat, and something else, small fragments of iron pyrite, a mineral that throws sparks when struck against flint. It took the team 4 years to rule out the obvious alternative explanation, a wildfire. The heat damage was too controlled, too localized, too consistent with a hearth. What they'd found wasn't the aftermath of nature. It was evidence of people striking sparks on purpose, at a spot they returned to again and again. The dating placed it at around 400,000 years ago, pushing back confirmed fire-making by roughly 350,000 years in a single discovery. That's not a campfire scene from a movie. That's proof in the ground that fire starting is a far older skill than anyone had confirmed. And by the time the last ice age hit its worst stretch, humans weren't just keeping embers alive. They'd gotten good at this. At a site called Korman 9, on the banks of the Dniester River in Ukraine, archaeologists went in expecting simple ash pits from people surviving the harshest years of the Ice Age. Instead, they found 3 carefully built hearths, flat and open, constructed with clear intention. Lab analysis showed the fires reached temperatures over 600 degrees Celsius. Some of the animal bones found nearby had been burned at over 650 degrees. That's hotter than 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, generated mostly from spruce wood, and likely supplemented with fat and bone once timber ran low on the open, treeless plains. What fire actually gave people wasn't just warmth, though that alone would have been enough to justify it. It let them cook food, making it safer and easier for the body to break down. It let them harden tools, changing what wood and stone could become in their hands. And it gave them light, stretching the number of usable hours in a day that, for much of the Ice Age, barely saw the sun at all. One discovery, for separate problems solved at once. That's the kind of advantage biology alone was never going to hand them. Fire solved the problem of a fixed spot. It didn't solve the problem of leaving it. Step away from a hearth, and the cold is right there waiting, which meant the next solution had to be something people could carry with them. And the earliest evidence for that solution isn't a guess. It's cut marks left in bone on the paw of a cave bear. At a site called Skåningen, in Germany, archaeologists studying cave bear remains found something on the small hand and foot bones that didn't fit the usual pattern. Cut marks on bones are normally read as evidence of butchering for meat, but there's almost no meat to speak of on a paw. The marks were fine, precise, and concentrated exactly where you'd cut if you were carefully peeling a hide away from the body intact. The bones dated to around 300,000 years ago. The conclusion researchers reached was straightforward. People at this site weren't just eating bears. They were skinning them, deliberately, for the fur. That's a wrap of hide thrown over the shoulders. It works to a point, but a loose skin leaks heat through every gap at the seams, and that's not enough to get through the worst of an ice age. The real leap didn't come from the hide itself. It came from a tool small enough to lose in your hand, a needle made from bone or ivory, with a tiny hole worked through one end. Eyed needles like this start appearing at sites across Eurasia somewhere between 30 and 50,000 years ago. That range matters more than it sounds like it should, because a needle is what turns a blanket into a coat. It's the difference between fabric draped over a person and fabric shaped to fit sleeves, a torso, a waistline, with seams that actually close instead of gaping open in the wind. People didn't stop there either. Before heading out into the cold, hunters rubbed rendered animal fat, tallow, over exposed skin on the face and neck, sealing it against windburn and heat loss. And out on open sunlit snow, where the glare alone could damage the eyes, some carved narrow slits into bone or wood and wore them like glasses, cutting the light down to a manageable line. A sewn coat, greased skin, bone slits over the eyes. None of it came from the body. All of it came from the hands. Clothing solved the problem of moving through the cold. It didn't solve the problem of having nowhere to stop. Out on the open steppe of what's now central Ukraine, there were no caves to retreat into and almost no trees to build with. The landscape had been stripped bare by wind and cold, flat in every direction. So the people living there used the one resource that wasn't in short supply, the remains of the animals that had come before them. At a site called Mezhirek, archaeologists uncovered the remnants of circular structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones and tusks. This wasn't a handful of bones stacked for effect. Each structure was built from hundreds of them, arranged with a level of planning that looks less like scavenging and more like architecture. The design worked in layers. Heavy skulls and long leg bones were set upright into the ground first, forming a solid base, something like a foundation. Ribs and curved tusks arched up from there to form the frame of the roof. At least one of these structures had its entrance formed by two tusks, appended and angled together to create an arch you'd walk through. Between the vertical leg bones making up the walls, jawbones were stacked chin down, layered tightly enough to build a real barrier against wind and cold. The whole structure was then likely covered with hides and turf, sealing the gaps and holding heat inside well enough to keep a family through the worst months of the year. Radiocarbon dating on small mammal remains found in the same layers has recently pinned down the age of the largest structure with more precision than ever before. Built and used right around 18,000 years ago, during the harshest stretch of the last ice age. That same recent analysis found something else worth sitting with. This wasn't a quick, one-season camp. The evidence suggests the structure was returned to and maintained across multiple generations, over centuries, not just a single winter. None of this needed a name or a diagram. It needed people willing to look at a mammoth skeleton, see the shape of a wall, an arch, a roof already sitting there in the bones, and build it. A shelter solved the problem of staying put. It didn't solve the problem of a landscape that emptied out for months at a time. Because the truth is, people didn't just dig in and wait for winter to pass. When conditions turned severe enough, entire groups picked up and moved, following the herds that were themselves following the only thing that mattered, where the food still was. Reindeer and horses shifted their range with the seasons, and human groups shifted right along with them, sometimes covering serious distance, occasionally pushing south entirely when a stretch of cold turned too extreme to wait out in place. Staying alive wasn't always about holding one position. It was about knowing when to leave it. That kind of mobility only worked if you could actually bring down what you were following, and by this point, hunting itself had changed. A spear thrown by hand only carries so much force and only travels so far, which is a real problem when your target is a mammoth or a woolly rhino capable of killing you in the time it takes to close the distance. The solution was a tool called an outlotl, a length of wood or bone that acts as an extension of the arm, adding leverage to a throw the same way a lever adds force to a push. It let a spear travel faster, farther, and harder than any arm could manage alone, which meant hunters could take down the largest, most dangerous animals on the landscape while keeping a survivable distance between themselves and the fight. A successful hunt still had to become food that would last, and that meant returning to the same techniques perfected everywhere else on this list. Meat was smoked and dried into something that would keep for weeks. Storage pits held food underground, where the earth kept a steady, safe temperature through the coldest months. Some meat was weighed down and sunk into cold ponds, held there like a natural refrigerator until it was needed. And movement paid off most clearly at places like the Rock of Solidaire, in eastern France, a tall limestone ridge that sat directly on a migration route horses and reindeer followed for tens of thousands of years. Hunters didn't need to chase anything across open ground. They only needed to know the route and be waiting when the herd arrived, using the terrain itself to close the trap. Fire, clothing, shelter, mobility. Every solution up to this point came from something people made or something people did. This one is different because in at least 2 cases, the adaptation wasn't behavior at all. It was the body itself changing. Neanderthals lived through cold stretches in Europe and Western Asia for over 100,000 years, and over that kind of time span, their bodies didn't stay the same shape as ours. Compared to modern humans, Neanderthal populations tended to have broader trunks and shorter limbs, a build that's consistent with basic thermoregulation. Less surface area relative to overall body mass means less area for heat to escape from, the same principle that explains why a compact build retains warmth better than a tall, lean one. Their nasal cavities show something just as specific. Research using computational modeling and internal scans suggests the internal shape of a Neanderthal nose was well suited to warming and humidifying freezing, dry air before it ever reached the lungs, essentially preconditioning every breath before it counted. That kind of slow, generational change didn't stop with an extinct species. Modern populations living in genuinely cold regions today, in parts of Siberia and Greenland, carry genetic variants linked to cold tolerance, differences that show up in the DNA of people whose ancestors spent countless generations in these environments. What's still an open question is how directly these specific traits trace back to ice age conditions themselves, as opposed to cold pressures that continued long after the ice sheets retreated. Researchers are upfront about that uncertainty rather than claiming it's settled. But if you want to see this principle taken to its most extreme, documented conclusion, there's no better case than the Yagan people, living at the southern tip of South America in conditions that stay brutally cold year-round. Early European visitors were reportedly stunned to find Yagan communities wearing little to no clothing at all in that climate, something that looked, on the surface, like it shouldn't have been survivable. Research into their physiology points to a real explanation: a notably higher baseline metabolic rate, generating more internal heat than most human bodies produce by default. They also relied on a deep squatting posture at rest, tucking the limbs in close to reduce exposed surface area even further. 2 different timelines, 2 different mechanisms, the same underlying lesson. Technology was never the only way through an ice age. Sometimes the body found its own way in. Every adaptation so far, whether built or inherited, still left one variable unaccounted for: other people. And how groups handled that variable turned out to matter just as much as fire or fur. Inside a single shelter, survival came down to numbers. More people lived under one roof than most of us would tolerate today, packed into far less space than we'd consider comfortable. And that crowding wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was strategy. A human body gives off real, usable heat, and enough bodies close together in a sealed structure can raise the internal temperature by a meaningful margin. The person with space to themselves wasn't fortunate. They were exposed. The pattern from hard winters is consistent. It was people living alone, often the elderly, who died first when conditions turned severe, simply because there was no one nearby to share warmth with. That same pressure didn't always produce cooperation. Cannibalism does appear in the Ice Age archaeological record, with cut marks and deliberate breakage on human bone at sites in England and Poland, some dated to around 18,000 years old. But recent research complicates the obvious assumption that this was starvation. Several studies looking closely at these sites found that living conditions at the time were actually favorable, which makes straightforward hunger an unlikely explanation. The more supported picture is something else entirely: ritual practice, funerary custom, or violence between groups competing over territory. The evidence itself isn't in question. The reason behind it still is. Cooperation extended past the walls of a single shelter too. Some sites show evidence that smaller bands didn't stay isolated from each other year-round. They gathered periodically, likely for reasons far more practical than social. These gatherings appear to have functioned as a wider safety net, a way to trade resources when one group's territory came up short, share information about where food or shelter could still be found, and find partners from outside a group small enough that everyone was already related. A single shelter could buffer against one bad night. A network between groups could buffer against an entire bad season. Warmth shared inside a shelter. Resources shared between them. Both were survival strategies built entirely on the same idea. Alone, the odds were worse. So, could you have survived a winter in the Stone Age? Not with one trick. Not with a single invention or a single lucky trait. It took a whole stacked system, working at once. Fire that could hit temperatures hotter than most modern furnaces. Clothing sewn tight enough to actually seal against the wind. Houses built from the bones of animals 20 times your size. Hunters who moved with the herds instead of waiting for them. Bodies that, in some populations, physically reshaped themselves across generations to fight off the cold from the inside. And people who understood, better than most of us do today, that survival got a lot easier the moment you stopped trying to do it alone. Some of it was genius. Some of it was inherited. And at least one part of it, the hibernation question buried in 400,000-year-old bone, is still being argued about by scientists right now. Which part of this surprised you most? Drop it in the comments, and subscribe if you want the next history deep dive when it drops.